This episode of Food Trucks in Babylon is dedicated to our dear friend, David Thoman, who has recently gone to be with the Lord. We deeply appreciated his friendship. We deeply appreciated his ministry. And so we would like to dedicate this episode to him.
You're listening to Food Trucks in Babylon, a Western Seminary podcast with Dr. Todd Miles and Dr. Patrick Schreiner. Listen as they discuss matters of faith, theology, and culture in a post-Christian world.
Hey, this is Patrick.
And this is Todd.
So we've been talking a lot about Christ in the Old Testament. Today, we are going to speak about how you preach Christ from the Old Testament.
We thought it's good because, Patrick, you and I, we do a lot of one-offs, right? And we probably talk more about biblical interpretation than what we actually do on Sunday morning after Sunday morning after Sunday morning. So we thought we'd get someone in here who preaches week after week after week. And so we invited Steve Mathewson in.
So Steve, can you just introduce yourself? He's been in pastoral ministry, right, for, you said 31 years?
Yes, hard to believe.
Yeah.
For a guy who's only 43. I wish.
So tell us where you are and what you've been doing there and what your role is, et cetera,
All right.
et cetera.
Well, thanks for having me on the podcast for this invitation. This is great. So I'm actually a Western Seminary alumnus. I graduated in 1986 and actually did an MA in Old Testament and then moved to Montana, was in pastoral ministry there for about 19 years, and then never thought I would move back to the Midwest. I love the West, but God in his sovereignty took us back to the Chicago area, which is interesting. Never had any desire to live in the Chicago area, but I love it. It's been great, and pastored Cross Life Evangelical Free Church there for the last 13 years. So yeah, I'm lead pastor, and we have some others who will share in the preaching, but I bet I preach probably 36, 37 times there a year.
And you've made your way back to Western Seminary also.
Yes, I was really honored to be asked to lead the D-Min program, so I'm director of the Doctor of Ministry program. I do that from a distance, and I do the big picture, the fun things. I get to kind of set the curriculum and line up faculty, and then our associate director here, kind of boots on the ground, that's David Thoman. He does all the hard work. He does all the administrative work, and I get to interact with students quite a bit, but he's always here when there are classes, and he does a great job. So yeah, that's kind of my other hat, I guess.
Can you tell us the makeup of the congregation in terms of, is it a more suburban area, demographically young, old, so forth and so on, just in terms of what the church looks like?
It's really interesting. I should probably back up and say I came from what I would describe as a urban church. It was in a rural setting in Montana, but 18 miles from Bozeman, which is a university town. And I knew this, but I didn't really realize until I left there how much it was influenced by the West Coast, Seattle, Portland, even the Bay Area. And so I moved back to the Chicago area. We're 38 miles from downtown. We're in the north suburbs, really in a very wealthy suburb. When we had twins when we were in Montana, and I remember using Similac formula, and they invented that and make that just a couple miles from where our church is, and we have a lot of engineers and scientists, and it's so it's a very wealthy, affluent area that we see Bears players in Target and things like that, and we're close to Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, which is a seminary like Western, and so we have a lot of those folks, but honestly, we have more PhDs in engineering and science fields. So it's that and corporate America. So we really have it's a suburban group. There is a lot of ethnic diversity. When I came, the church was it had been a good church over the years, but I think it was, as churches or institutions do, it was I think maybe some of the glory days were behind, and so it really had to just work with the staff on changing the culture, and we lost a few people, but we just see a lot of younger families now, and that's been great. So, in fact, I preached last Sunday on out of Titus 2, 1-15, and talked about just the challenges of living out the gospel as a multi-generational church, and we really are.
And so remind me, you said you did 1 degree at Western.
Yes.
And then have you done, where did you get your degrees from?
Yeah, so I finished undergrad at Multnomah in Portland, then did the MA at Western. Then I did a doctor of ministry and preaching at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, and my mentor for that was Haddon Robinson.
Nice. Yeah.
That was set up a little bit more like a European model where you're just working with one mentor. Yeah. And then my torturous form of adult learning, I'm in a PhD program in Hebrew Bible with it's through the University of Stellenbosch in South Africa, but my advisor is a guy named Christo Vandermerve. He's a well-known Hebrew Bible scholar, and so I'm trying to finish a dissertation. I've been at it about 3.5. Well, actually longer than that.
I didn't know that either.
Yeah.
But you volunteered to do this study.
Yes, isn't that crazy? But I've been in the program officially for 3.5 years. I've been working with him for 4.5, and I really need to be done about 1.5 years from now. So we'll see.
And your work with Haddon Robinson, we'll probably get to this more, but that was probably what produced your book, The Art of Preaching Old Testament Narratives.
It really was. Yeah. I went in knowing that I wanted to do some work on Old Testament narrative, and that kind of came out of my time here at Western. I was teaching assistant in Hebrew, and I remember teaching a couple of class sessions in an exegesis course, and I did a lot of work on narrative and realized I don't know what I'm doing here. So that kind of set me on a journey. And I did my DMin dissertation on Hebrew narrative.
Well, maybe we'll return to some of that, but some of what we wanted to talk to you about from a more practical week in, week out perspective. Todd and I, as we said, have been talking about Christ in the Old Testament, Christ in all of the scriptures. And, we talked a little more theoretically. I mean, we had some points in terms of how you preach, but why is it important? How do you do it? And so maybe we can just ask and glean from your wisdom here in terms of preaching Christ from all of the scriptures and specifically the Old Testament. And just to begin us, maybe this is a silly question. You can just tell me if this is a silly question too.
Okay.
But do you distinguish between gospel-centered sermons and Christ-centered sermons, or, I'll throw in another one, Trinitarian-centered sermons?
Okay.
So when you're teaching a preaching class, do you like to use that terminology, and why, and what sort of terminology do you use? And maybe even tell us a little bit about your journey of coming to believe that is a way to preach if you hold to one of those.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I have thought about that. I think I don't differentiate a lot between the two. Maybe the way I would look at it is to say, okay, they're two overlapping circles, but there's a lot of overlap. I mean, if your sermon is gospel-centered, how can it we're talking about the gospel of Jesus Christ.
How can it not be Christ-centered also?
Yeah, right. How can it not be Christ-centered? I do think sometimes Christ-centered has gotten, just the label has gotten a bit of a bad rap because it's been used to describe sermons that are kind of making that leap, sometimes an artificial leap from some detail in the text to Jesus. And I think even larger than that, some in the Christ-centered camp in the past have been very reluctant to, I think, to preach the ethical thrust or the imperatives of Scripture. And I don't think there's a contradiction between those at all.
Trying to avoid moralism,
exactly,
sort of thing, in which case you undercut the gospel, perhaps.
And any attempt to do that gets labeled as well. You're not really preaching Christ-centered sermon. It's like you either do that or you say, this is how you live. But there doesn't have to be a contradiction between those two.
That's right.
So, I mean, you ask how I got started in that area, and I think I came out of maybe the camp where I want to preach the text, the theology of the text, and don't make some kind of an artificial leap to Jesus. So preach what's there, and in the context of a Christian worship service, the people will see how this fits in. Mm-hmm. But what I've realized, and this began here at Western, even in the mid-'80s, I had a professor here, Ron Allen. I really credit him for teaching me biblical theology. And I had a couple of classes from him in biblical theology. And I think as I've grown over the years, I've recognized that, wow, the Bible fits together as a story, and Christ is at the center of that. So whatever passage I'm preaching really has to be grounded in that larger story. Mm. And so that's the way that that's the way I'll get to Christ. It's interesting. Brian Chappell wrote Christ-Centered Preaching,
mm-hmm. Right.
And yet his approach is, make sure that what you're preaching is really rooted and based in the gospel.
Right. And so you want to rename it for Brian Chappell?
Yeah.
You've pitched that to him.
Yeah, that's right.
Just get half of the proceeds.
That's right. Oh, man. But that it is an interesting issue. I think early on I was really concerned about, I want to understand the theological message of a text. What's the theology? And understanding, even in the Old Testament, that even in narrative, which I've worked a lot in, that the narratives are not just illustrations, or it's not just history for history's sake, but I think of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. I mean, those are former prophets in the Hebrew Bible, which means that they're delivering a prophetic message. Mm-hmm. It's just that that prophetic message is being delivered through the vehicle of narrative, and I want to be faithful and true to that. So you ask a little bit about my approach. It would be to identify, okay, what's the theology of the text? What's the message? What's God calling his people to be or to do? But then making sure that that's connected to the larger story of the Bible, which is Christ. Mm-hmm. Always saying it's only possible to do this because of what Christ has done for us. And then I do think there are times where you can draw lines, say from David, where he is a type of Christ, and I'm fine with doing that. I don't know that I do that as much as some. I'm always cautious. I want to be careful not to find types where they're not. For example, as preachers I really respect, think of Samson as a type of Christ. I think, man, I'm not so sure about that. I think what you do with Samson is to say he embodies the opposite of what Jesus did. He's an anti-type, I guess. Right.
So is that the kind of vocab that you would use, or do you avoid like typology? I mean,
I don't have any problem using that. I don't always use that when I preach, but that's probably part of a bigger issue. I really try not to just use the language of the academy, or what we might call shop talk. So I'm always thinking about, even though I have profs in our church from Trinity, it'd be like having you guys sitting there. I think I worry more though about the couple who are down the street who are atheists, but they're really interested in finding out more of the Bible. So I'm not afraid of the word type. Yeah, and I might use that, but probably that would get filtered out just for reasons of not being too technical.
Yeah. So, can you give us maybe a few guidelines that you think through when you're seeking to connect a text to Christ? Just as you're going through the process, what kind of avenues of thinking help you as you're saying, okay, how do I lead people to the gospel here or to Christ?
Sure.
And maybe guidelines, again, isn't the best word, but just kind of like your thinking processes through that.
Right. Like I say, I tend to start with, okay, what's the theological message of the text? And then to say, okay, now how is it located in that larger story? And I think what I'll often do is to say, all right, what's the issue or theme? And for example, I was preaching recently, just a few weeks ago, I went through Ezekiel last half of 33 through 39. And in chapter 34, I mean, it's about the false shepherds of Israel.
Yes.
And I mean, that was an easy one
Yep.
to say, okay, when you trace through, the idea of shepherds in the Bible and the way that analogy is used for leaders, Jesus is the good shepherd. He embodies everything that should be. So that was not a difficult leap.
But you have to be aware of like the New Testament's use of Jesus looking at them and saying,
"You're really
sheep you're sheep without a shepherd."
Absolutely.
And he's totally drawing on that imagery.
It is. I mean, John 10.
Good shepherd.
Yeah, and we know that happened around Hanukkah, Feast of Dedication,
Right.
and at dedication or Hanukkah, Ezekiel 34 was one of the passages that was read.
Yeah.
And sometimes you get a theme. I've preached Psalm 46 not that long ago, and the whole emphasis on God's presence,
Right.
or even if you're in Psalm 23 in God's presence, and that's one where then you think, okay, how does that work? How does that connect to Jesus? And well, that's not hard, but you have to pursue that and say, well, Jesus is the new temple. He's God come in human flesh. Yeah, he's Emmanuel, God with us.
Yeah.
And even then in Matthew at the end of the gospel and his Great Commission, I'm with you always.
So. And so homiletically, how might you actually transition? So you've thought through this. You've done your work in the Psalm, and then and you see the connection, presence with Christ.
Yeah.
How might you actually transition so it's not just, hey, here's Psalm 23, and oh, by the way, Jesus says he'll be with us always?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I probably do some of that intuitively, but if I was to break that down, I think one way would be to say, maybe if it's something more positive. Well, in Ezekiel 34, it's not positive, but if you say, God is. God promises that he's going to raise up a good shepherd, a David.
Yeah.
And that David is none other than Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
I think at other times it might be a little bit more subtle. And it might even be, this is what God calls his people to do. And the only way that we can do that is in the power that Christ provides and the strength that he provides or the example that he provides. So I might make a transition like that.
And so when you're actually preaching and you have to articulate this, there are a lot of different ways that you can get there to instruct your congregation on how you have made this connection and how they ought to be thinking about it.
That's true, and I think that's so important because week in and week out, you don't want it to sound formulaic.
Yeah, right. And now Jesus.
And now
I think it's actually good to introduce Christ at different points in the sermon to not make it. I mean, especially if you're preaching week in and week out. If your congregation is always like, well, he'll get to it in the conclusion. Here it is. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It might be wise to kind of change up the way you do things just so that people aren't like,
absolutely.
Okay, he's following the formula of preaching.
That is so true.
Yeah, that's good. Are there ever times in a sermon when you don't get to the gospel or to Christ? Now, again, that might sound like a strange question, but I'm thinking like, okay, so you're doing a sermon on prayer, or you're doing a sermon on the radical. Well, this one won't work so well, but I was just thinking like the radical nature of sin. Maybe you're doing something in Romans 1.
Yeah,
and you're thinking, I kind of want to just leave people resting on you need a savior, but I don't want to get there until I get there in a few weeks in Romans 3 or something like that.
Sure.
Is there ever a time where you're just like, I want to let this rest on them. We're gonna get there later, or I want to more focus on this theme, and it'll feel too forced in prayer to go to the Lord's Prayer, or that we can only pray through Jesus.
That's a great question. I mean, even in our ministry staff or other pastors, we've wrestled with that at times, and I guess my answer is maybe I want my cake and eat it too, or I want to do both. I first of all, I do feel like, hey, there could be some people that they can't wait until next week, or they can't wait until 3 weeks.
That's right.
They've got to have the gospel.
Right.
So I'm always going to get to Christ, but I am aware that there might be times where I need to let this sink in a little bit more, and I might get to the end and say, that there is good news,
right?
And it's the person of Jesus Christ, and I might say we're going to see that as we get into subsequent chapters, but I do want them. Yeah, I guess I want to leave them hanging, but not hanging.
Right. Yeah.
Come back next week.
Yes, yeah. And that way, if they're ready, if they're desperate, they can talk to me afterwards or to someone else. At least I've given them enough to say, hey, the answer is in the person of Jesus, and at least there's something then that we can talk further about that. But I do like to not to go too far into say Romans 3. If I'm in Romans 1, I want to wait till I get there.
Mm-hmm. That's good. We're going to take a little break now, and we're going to come back and discuss some more of these things. Hi, my name is Eric, and I'm in the MDiv program at Western Seminary. My favorite part about studying here is being able to develop those close relationships with fellow students in and outside of the classroom, while discovering how I can love God with my whole life. I also really appreciate that my professors care about what I'm learning alongside my personal spiritual formation. Western Seminary offers a number of programs to help students prepare for the work God has called them to do through rigorous education designed with practical application. If you are interested in learning more about Western or starting your application, visit us online at westernseminary.edu. Now, back to the show. Okay, welcome back. Steve, I'm going to ask you a little bit different of a question now. So the name of this podcast is Food Trucks in Babylon, and so we like to ask our guests about food.
All right.
And so you live in Chicago,
yes,
but you come out here and visit. Is there any, maybe I'll just start. We didn't pre-think this, so I don't know what you're going to say. Any food trucks here in Portland that you would point to people in terms of when they come out to Portland, you just got to try this thing? Or if there's nothing there, like you just don't have enough time in Portland, maybe you can tell us about some food you really like in Chicago.
Sure. Or I can do both.
Or you can do both. We can talk about food and other things for a long time.
I probably haven't visited enough of the food carts to know which ones I prefer, but I like them all. I think it's cool. There's one on, I often stay with a friend in Happy Valley, and there's one on 82nd. What is it? If you're heading south, is it right after Foster?
Yes.
Somewhere.
I know there's a large food cart pod there.
So there's one there.
82nd. Is it Portland Mercado? No.
I'm not sure what it is.
Okay. What type of food is it?
They have a little bit of everything. So I've visited that. I like those. I like there's kind of a single food cart if you're driving on, is it Stark or Washington? You're heading west towards
the river.
If you get off at 2 at 5.
Yep.
Yeah.
Probably Stark.
And kind of after you go through that little stretch where there's some restaurants and things before you kind of head around Mount Tabor, there's kind of a single food, or maybe there's a couple of them there, but there's one that has Mexican food, and that's pretty good. I've tried that before. And then I don't know, some that aren't food carts, but man, I like PDX sliders.
Oh, you're speaking my language.
Talking your language.
Don't start me on that.
I know. And how about the screen door on?
I've never been there, believe it or not.
You've got to.
I know.
So,
I just admitted that.
So when we lived
my
here,
wife's gluten free, so it doesn't work so well for us.
Yeah. Well, when we lived here,
she's Southern though.
That's right. So we lived at 24th and Taylor when I went to seminary. I think that's on 24th and Burnside. But a friend of mine took me there. So every time I'm here, I try to find an excuse to go to the screen door.
Nice.
So,
and then, are you a big fan of deep dish pizza?
I love pizza. Yeah,
Okay.
I always have, and it was fun. Yeah, moving to the Chicago area. Kind of the big three, or I'm sure there's a big five, but of course there's Gino Zis, Giordano's, Lou Malnati's. I'm kind of a Lou Malnati's fan. I like that. But I have to say my favorite pizza place is a deep dish place that's out in the suburbs in Lake Bluff. It's called The Silo. And I was just there the other day. I took the family, but I think my wife and I I take her there about once a week. I mean, it's so bad that sometimes the server will say, "Okay, you want this, and this."
That's me with PDX Sliders. They know me and my family there. Actually, my wife was pregnant with Kanan while we were going there, and the owner was like, "That baby's gonna come out craving aioli," because they put aioli all over those burgers.
It is the best hamburger.
That's right. Man. The other thing we should mention about Steve, which is very interesting and cool, is that you are a big fly fisher. Yeah. And not only that, but you've done podcasting on fly fishing, and you just ended that. So just give us just a brief snapshot of
how is the fly fishing in the Midwest, in
Chicago. I'll tell you, it's different. Although I've caught salmon on a fly rod in the Milwaukee River in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, not all that far from, it's probably within a couple miles of the Bradley Center where the Milwaukee Bucks play. Yes. And there's actually some areas in southwest Wisconsin, southeast Minnesota. It's called the Driftless because the glaciers drifted around it. They didn't drift through it and flatten everything. And so you have these valleys and spring creeks, and they're full of trout. They've done a great job managing them. But I still get out to Montana at least once a year and fly fish. But so, I have a friend. He and I went. Well, we started at a small college in Montana. Then we both finished at Multnomah. I went to Western. He went to Denver Seminary. He wrote for Leadership, Christianity Today for several years, and then started another business. And anyway, he's in Wheaton, and so he had this idea that we do a fly fishing podcast. So we did it for 4 years, and we're 12 episodes into our fifth year, and we decided a few weeks ago, you know what, it's time to wrap this up. We've loved doing it, but we would batch record these episodes, but we did an episode every week. So for 4 years and 3 months, I guess.
I don't know how you have that many words to say about fly fishing, but I'm impressed.
I am too.
I feel like I would have, about 5 minutes worth of material.
That's all it would take me.
Which basically means
I was joking when I talked about when I asked him about fly fishing in the Midwest, and I'm also thinking that must have been a serious call to Chicago.
It
to
really
leave
was.
Montana when you're a fly fisherman.
It really was.
We can call you out here. There's some good fly fishing out here.
I know there really is in Oregon too.
I'll talk to Randy.
I know it. But what we did is, it kind of sounds silly because our listener base has kept going up, and the other day it hit 9,403 subscribers, on iTunes. So, we were almost at 10,000, but we realized, we were starting to run out of material because this is an avocation, not a vocation. It's kind of a hobby. And we both had some other things we needed to do. I need to finish that dissertation. And
if you can just get on there one more time and plug this podcast, get all your subscribers over here.
I know it.
Fly fishing and theology.
Because I don't think we're quite to that level yet.
No.
But you'll get there. You will get there.
That's right. Yeah. Well, maybe we can talk a little bit more about some of your passion in terms of Old Testament narratives. You wrote a whole book on that. You did a lot of studies on that. And I just see from the book itself that you have a chapter called The Shape of Stories, and that immediately interests me. Maybe just speak a little bit about what should people be looking for as they look through Old Testament narratives in terms of shaping the stories. Narratives, I think, are hard for us sometimes. In one sense, we're very story people, but in another sense, maybe we gravitate towards very propositional truths.
Oh, we really do.
And we see a story and we're like, I love it, but I'm not sure how to preach a narrative.
I know. Well, I think I realized this about myself. When I was in high school, there was an insurance company that had this essay contest, and the contest was like there was a $500 first place prize, $100 second, $50 third place. So I entered this thing. I was a junior in high school, and I won third place. That was good. Well, we went to this, this insurance convention, and each of the winners, we read our stories, and I was kind of miffed because the person who won first place just told a story about their family, and the dad was injured and how insurance. And I thought, come on, I had all this research, I had facts and statistics, and I was kind of put out that somebody won it. But then later it dawned on me, you know what? There is power in story.
That's right.
And so you come to Scripture, and depending on who you talk to, I mean, Bible is what, a third or maybe even more,
more than that
narrative. Yeah. And even in the New Testament, people, we think about the letters and how many letters there are, but when you look at just by sheer page count,
word count,
Gospels and
overwhelming
Acts.
Narrative,
and from Genesis to Revelation, it's a beginning to the end of story.
Yeah, it really is. Yeah. So one of the things that I've done over the years, I've had to learn how to understand stories. In fact, I have a friend a pastor who always calls me and says, what do you think about this narrative? You're the expert, and he means that. And I'll listen to him, and I said, man, John, that was brilliant. You nailed it. You do it intuitively. I had to write the book to figure it out. I really did. But one of the things I've done is to say, okay, when you look at a story or study a narrative, look for the acts, ACTS. And again, you have to be careful not to...
and that's not adoration, confession, thanksgiving, supplication.
It is not. Okay. It is not.
All right.
No. Although
I was just making sure.
That would be a good response, I suppose, when you read the narrative. But no, the first thing would be to say, okay, A is for action. And I like the fact that the A comes first, because I do think narratives are plot-driven in Scripture, and... just saying, okay, how does a narrative work? And I mean, basically, any narrative, any good story has a crisis and it has a resolution. And what's the crisis and how is it resolved? And so go into more detail on that, but that's a key. And then C would be characters. Who are the characters, and how do they develop? And what's interesting, in some stories, you might have a character who's the hero in one, but more of a villain in another. I mean, that can be David. And so you're always looking at how the characters develop. And then the T is a highly technical term, talking.
Okay.
So, action characters.
Me too.
Talking. Yeah, I guess we need a good German word for that. But but really, I agree with Robert Alter, who says that dialogue or the conversation in between the characters is used by the biblical narrators to carry a large freight of meaning.
And that's hard because if you've written, dialogue is not easy to write.
No, it's not.
Into a story.
It's not. So you'll often look at the dialogue and find out, okay, this is where the narrative, this is where the meaning is. I mean, Joseph in Genesis 50, verse 20, that's kind of a classic. You meant this for evil, but God meant it for good. Well, I think you kind of get at the meaning of the whole narrative, what we often call the Joseph story, although it's more than that, but there's the meaning right there. And then the S would be the setting, and that's saying kind of two settings. One is the historical, cultural, but the other is a literary setting, and saying, okay, so here's a story about David and Abigail in 1 Samuel 25, and it's about David not taking revenge on on Abigail's husband, Naboth. And it's interesting because it's sandwiched right between two narratives where where David has the opportunity to take Saul's life and he doesn't, and he demonstrates the fact he understands, I can't take revenge on the Lord's anointed, But in 25, he has to learn, and God uses Abigail to show him you can't take revenge on a fool either. You have to leave vengeance with the Lord.
That's good.
So, yeah. So I use those, but then I tell people, hopefully, this will be something that's not mechanical, so that when you sit down, you just, okay, A, C, T, S, and you go through these, and I guess that would be like taking a rose from the Portland Rose Festival. See what I did there?
That was nice.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah.
It would be like taking that rose and pulling the petals out and setting them on the table in neat order.
Right.
Just analyzing
and then
them
you've
to
destroyed
death.
the story.
You have.
Destroyed the rose.
So I think what I try to do with those categories is to say, okay, learn these, but then hopefully that'll just become a way of reading.
Okay.
Here's a question that I struggled with myself related to narratives. I think I myself have a tendency, and the nature of preaching has a tendency to take a story and turn it into propositional truths.
Yeah.
And I've always wondered, wait a second, like, should I preach narratives more narratively and then preach Paul more didactically? But then I find myself still trying to say, like, okay, here's some of the things we learned from this story. And I don't think that's wrong, but there's just kind of been this question in my mind in terms of, should I be more story-oriented as I preach these narratives? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I really do. I do think that, I guess I'm big on preaching Scripture the way it came to us, and as much as I can. I mean, that doesn't mean if I'm preaching Psalms, I'm speaking in lines of parallel poetry, but I think there should be some poetic flair.
I would like you to do that.
That'd be great.
Yeah, well, I'll have to prepare for that. I've never done that before.
Pastor Steve didn't rhyme very well this morning. I'm really disappointed.
Yeah, that's
more
right.
selahs, more selahs.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, fill in with selahs.
So you like to take it more narrative?
Yeah, with the narrative,
text.
I like it to kind of to have a story shape to it. What I typically do is just build my sermon on the crisis and the resolution, and then say, okay, typically these will be more inductive, where that is your main idea is going to come at the end of the sermon, and you get that aha moment, and then I'll base application on that rather than say going through and saying, in this story we learned 5 principles. There are always principles or truths about anger or about whatever, but. So yeah, I think it's good if we can to preach in a narrative format, because these are narratives, they're stories, and then I do think they communicate propositions, but kind of aiming at that. What's really the central idea? What's the central theological message? I mean, if this is a former prophet, what's the prophetic message? What's God saying to His people? And do that, and then often at that point, that's where I'll say, did you notice how this story points to Jesus? Or there's no way we can do this apart from the work of Christ in our lives. Or to say, there's only one person who has ever done this fully or embodied this fully, and it's Jesus.
Yeah. So you mentioned about maybe there's some sort of ethical demand placed upon the characters. And earlier we mentioned there's a little bit of a controversy. Are you preaching the gospel, or are you preaching moralism?
Yeah.
Where do you come down on taking characters and using them as exemplars?
Sure.
Examples of certain kinds of behaviors that you ought to emulate?
Sure.
Or is it always just ought not to emulate?
Yeah, I really try to shy away from that. What I've done over the years is to say, okay, what's the theological message? And it may line up with what the character does or doesn't do, but it might not. Okay. I think the Ehud story in Judges 3, 12 to 30 is a great example. A lot of people will preach that, and we need to be like Ehud and use our unique.
Like
he was left-handed, and I think that
I am
story.
left-handed, so I appreciate that.
Okay,
yeah.
Well,
no, I'm just kidding.
I'm going to ruin it for you.
No, I was actually felt called into ministry because of that text.
Over here.
Because the left hand.
Well, now you're going to be.
You're ruining my dreams, Steve.
I know it. I know it.
Okay, keep going.
No, I think the main idea of that narrative is what God's saying to His people is that Yahweh, or God, delivers His people in surprising, unexpected ways. And I think that's the encouragement. And then from that, I'll say, you think about that. That happens all throughout Scripture. How about Moses and the ark? Moses and the ark. He was in an ark, a little basket, but the word is ark. He was saved that way.
Noah,
And of course Noah. But how did what about Esther? But then I'll get to Jesus and say, who would have thought that God Himself would come in human flesh? And so anyway, back to your point, I don't think it lines up with the characters. Now, the very next narrative, Judges 4, the story of Deborah and Barak, but actually the hero is not only Deborah, but it's Jael. And I do think the big idea there kind of ties into the characters, but I would rather teach preachers, and I try to do this myself, is to say, what's the theological message? If it lines up with what the character did, well, that's fine. Call that out. This is really interesting. D.A. Carson, Don Carson, who's kind of one of the spokespeople for Christ-centered preaching, biblical theology, was on he was being interviewed by R.C. Sproul. You can find this on YouTube or something. Yeah. And they're talking about canonical interpretation. And Don says, it's interesting. Sometimes, preachers will preach these narratives and, David did this and you should too, or David didn't do this, or David was bad, you shouldn't be bad. And he says, and then they learn about these biblical theological trajectories and they preach those. He says, but then they forget about the moral imperatives that Elijah, or that James could say, Elijah was a man like us, and he prayed, and we ought to pray. And that kind of stunned me. I thought, wow, this is Don Carson saying this. And R.C. Sproul kind of went on to another topic. I don't know what he thought of the answer, but I thought, man, that's further than I might go, because I've been kind of encouraging people not to at least begin with the characters. But I think Don's right. You look at the New Testament, and he says, look what the New Testament authors do, and they do a variety of things, and we can too.
That's right.
So that's been really helpful to me.
That's good.
And that would even include moral example occasionally.
Exactly, yeah. It's just when moral examples are the only thing you do.
Yeah,
and when you fail
to that.
Exactly. And when you fail to show that the only way we can do this is because of the gospel's transforming power in our lives. And that has to be there. In fact, that's Chappell's big thing in his preaching book. He says it's not a problem to say this is what God calls us to do. But by the way, Sidney Graydonis, his book Preaching Christ in the Old Testament, I appreciate that, but I kind of liked his earlier stuff better. I thought he had a better synthesis. Make a long story short, his doctoral dissertation was called Sola Scriptura, and it's simultaneously the most fascinating and the most boring thing you could ever read, because it's full of all these names. It is. It's full of all these names and details, but fascinating story that the Dutch Reformed churches in Holland, right before World War II, were arguing over whether to preach redemptive historical, which is Christ-centered, or exemplary, which is this is what the characters do or don't. And it's interesting, those were the two poles.
Historical, example of,
And even in the Dutch Reformed Church then, which you'd think, that would be all Christ-centered. Right. That was a debate.
Oh, interesting.
And then World War II happened, and they dropped it, as you can understand. They're just fighting for their lives. And after the war, there was a schism in the church, and they never picked it up. So Graydonis in 1970 wrote his doctoral dissertation on that, and he said, he argued for a mediating position.
Yeah, okay. Interesting.
He said, I think that with the redemptive historical, we have to show that these stories are located in a larger storyline with Christ as the hero. But he said, with the exemplary, we can't ignore the ethical thrust. That was his words.
Okay.
And I thought that was a great synthesis. But then when he wrote Preaching Christ from the Old Testament, which is a great book, but he kind of recanted that, and he takes more of a Lutheran view as opposed to a Calvin's view. And I think sometimes even I highly respect him, but some of the sermons I've heard, it's the big idea is always so
Yeah.
Jesus is our Savior, which is such a precious truth. But I think some maybe who have followed that then have been really reluctant to preach the ethical thrust.
Yeah. So in terms of learning more about these things, one of the things you do is lead the D-Min program here at Western Seminary.
Yeah.
Would that be a good place to think more about these things? What kind of things are they doing in the classes? And just briefly tell us about that.
It really would be. We have right now we're kind of moving to a cohort model.
Yes.
So if you come in, you're studying with the same cohort, kind of like what you do, Patrick, with the Theophilus cohort on the MDiv or MA level.
Exactly.
But one of the tracks would be preaching, and there's that Christ-centered focus. We do have courses on that, on preaching the Old Testament, preaching the New Testament. We really make an effort to show that this is how you do this in a Christ-centered way that's faithful to the text, and that does, especially in the Old Testament, that doesn't kind of skirt around the historical grammatical interpretation, because that's what a lot of people are worried about. You don't take the text seriously on its own, and that's true. We've got to do that, but at the end of the day, I think when you preach, you have to do some biblical theology, and that's where I would differ from somebody like Abraham Curavella. And I can say that because we're friends, and I've said that before. We were on a panel at ETS, and I know he says he doesn't think there's a place for biblical theology in a sermon, and I love his methodology until he gets to that point, and then I say, but we need to ground this in the larger story of the Bible. So anyway,
too bad for Stephen. No, I'm just kidding.
Well, it did get him killed.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
And you guys have guest lecturers come in. Just one more question too or guest teachers. Who are some of the people that come in that you guys have lined up
in the D-Min program? Yep. Sure. So we try to use some of our own faculty, but then we will bring in, say, in the preaching cohorts, we have people like Dan Doriani, Brian Chappell, for example, and some others that are kind of
Robert
like
Smith,
that.
Hasn't he come in?
Yes,
class?
right.
Yep.
He has. One of the things we're doing that I'm excited about, and you guys better be too, because you're involved, and I know you are, is we're doing a theology and ministry cohort. So that'll be you, Todd, and then we've got Ryan Lister, Western faculty, involved in that, and then pulling in a couple people from outside. We've got Kevin Van Hooser is going to be part of that, and Todd Wilson, Center for Pastoral. What's
theology?
That?
It's not pastoral theology, but
pastoral.
The Center for Pastoral.
I know there's theology mixed in there somewhere.
I don't know what it is. Yeah. Okay.
Center for it's Pastor Theologian.
Pastor Theologian.
Sorry, Todd, if you're listening to this, I totally butchered.
Pastor Theologian. That's it.
Yeah. I totally butchered his organization, but but he'll be in as well, and so those are the kind of people that we're trying to bring in.
Right.
But using our own faculty, because we have a great faculty here at Western.
That's right.
Well,
we appreciate you coming in to talk to us about these things and being in Portland. It's fun to have you here, and we hope this will be helpful for people as they think about preaching Christ in the Old Testament and seeing how all of the scriptures point to him.
Hey, this is Todd. We have received a lot of good feedback on this podcast. We have also received some questions. You have been emailing them to us, and we want to encourage you to consider that.
That's right. So we plan on doing an episode where we just answer questions. So we'd love to have you send those things in to podcast@westernseminary.edu, podcast singular at westernseminary.edu. And Todd, how can they send those questions?
Well, you can either type them out in the email, but what would be even better is if you created an audio file asking the question and send that to us.
Right. We need to keep that at 20 seconds and we'll play it. And so send in. We'd love to hear the audio clip of your voice. We'd play it and then we'd answer the question as best we can. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to Food Trucks in Babylon. The music you hear is provided by our friends at Humble Beast Records. If you like the show, please leave us a review and feel free to subscribe. To learn more about Western Seminary, visit us at westernseminary.edu.